quiet woman sat silently, hiding a secret nobody could imagine. She hid her fighter ace status for 12 years, pretending to be an ordinary passenger. Nobody knew until the pilot collapsed mid-flight and she seized the controls. Minutes later, F-22s called her Viper over the radio. Her secret returned. Before you watch, full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. She hid her fighter A status for 12 years, and nobody on Flight 219 ever guessed it. To the passengers around her, Diane Foster was just a tired woman in seat 14C, wearing a plain gray sweater, sipping black coffee, and reading a paperback mystery novel. She looked like any other woman flying home from a work trip, someone with a laptop bag under the seat and tired eyes from too many meetings. Nobody knew that Diane once flew an F-15 fighter jet at twice the speed of sound. Nobody knew she had 5 confirmed kills in the sky, and a call sign that pilots still whispered about with respect. 12 years ago, she was known as Viper, one of the best fighter pilots the Air Force ever trained. She had flown through enemy fire without blinking, had guided younger pilots home safely more times than she could count, and had a reputation for staying calm when everyone else around her panicked. After a mission went wrong and she lost her wingman over hostile territory, she walked away from flying forever. She never spoke about it, not to her family, not to her co-workers, not even to the quiet voice in her own head that sometimes still asked her if she missed the sky. She built a quiet life as an accountant in a small office near her home, and she planned to keep that life forever, safe and small and forgettable. The plane was flying smoothly at 34,000 feet when the trouble started. Diane felt it before anyone else did, a strange shake under her feet, so small most people wouldn't notice it. She had felt that same shake 100 times before, high above deserts and oceans, and her whole body went alert before her mind even understood why. A moment later, the intercom crackled, and a flight attendant asked in a slightly nervous voice if there was a doctor on board. Diane looked up from her book. Something was wrong, and old instincts she thought she had buried years ago were already waking up inside her chest. Word spread through the cabin fast, the way bad news always does on an airplane. The captain had suddenly grabbed his chest and slumped forward in his seat. The first officer was young, on only his 3rd flight as second in command, and his voice shook badly when he spoke over the intercom, asking again for any doctor or nurse to come forward immediately. Diane closed her book slowly and set it on her tray table. She was not a doctor, but she knew planes better than almost anyone else on this flight, and something told her that the first officer needed more than medical help. He needed someone who understood what was happening in that cockpit. A nurse rushed forward from the back of the plane and disappeared through the cockpit door to help the captain. 2 minutes later, the plane suddenly dipped, then leveled again, then dipped harder, throwing loose items across the cabin. People screamed. Bags fell from the overhead bins and rolled down the aisle. Diane's coffee cup slid off her tray table and shattered on the floor near her feet. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, holding the seat backs to steady herself as the plane shook violently around her. She had trained herself for 12 years to stay calm and ordinary, to blend into rooms full of spreadsheets and quiet conversations about tax season. But until the pilot collapsed, she had never needed to break that promise to herself. And now everything changed in a single, terrifying second. She moved down the aisle toward the cockpit, ignoring the shouts behind her telling her to sit back down and stay calm. A flight attendant tried to stop her at the cockpit door, holding her arm firmly, but Diane spoke with a calm, hard voice that surprised even herself. "I can fly this plane. Let me in." The flight attendant froze at the certainty in her tone, then slowly stepped aside. Inside the cockpit, the scene was worse than she expected. The captain was unconscious on the floor, his face pale, and the nurse was checking his pulse with shaking hands, unsure of what else she could do at this altitude. The first officer was gripping the controls too tightly, his eyes wide with fear, sweat running down his face and soaking his collar. The plane was drifting off course, the nose slightly too low, the wings tilted at a dangerous angle that made Diane's stomach tighten. Diane slid into the empty captain's seat without asking permission, her hands already reaching for the controls out of pure instinct. "I need you to trust me," she told the first officer firmly. "I have flown before. Let me help you fly this plane." The first officer stared at her like she was crazy, a stranger in a gray sweater suddenly claiming she could save them. But he had no other option left. He nodded quickly, and Diane placed her hands on the controls. The moment her fingers touched the yoke, 12 years disappeared completely. Her hands remembered everything her mind had tried so hard to forget. She checked the instruments, calling out numbers calmly and clearly. Altitude, speed, heading. The plane steadied slightly under her guidance, but the engines were making a strange, grinding sound, and warning lights blinked red across the entire panel in front of them. "We have an engine problem," Diane said, reading the gauges quickly with sharp, practiced eyes. "Fuel pressure is dropping fast in engine 2. We need to shut it down before it catches fire." The first officer's hands trembled badly as he followed her instructions, flipping switches one by one under her guidance. The plane shuddered hard as the engine powered down completely, and for a moment it felt like they were falling out of the sky. Diane pushed the nose down slightly to keep their speed steady, using only one working engine to hold the heavy aircraft level. It was not easy. The plane fought her the entire way, heavier and slower than any jet she had ever trained on, but her hands stayed steady, and her mind stayed clear and focused. Air traffic control came on a radio, confused about why the plane had suddenly changed course and lost altitude without a proper request. Diane grabbed the radio herself, her voice sharp and controlled. "This is Flight 219, she said. "Captain is unconscious. I'm a former military pilot assisting the first officer. We have lost one engine and need immediate clearance for emergency landing." There was a pause on the radio, then a rushed reply granting them a direct path toward the nearest airport, though the controller's voice sounded uncertain about who exactly was flying the plane. But the flight path took them dangerously close to a restricted military zone, and within minutes, 2 fighter jets appeared beside the plane, one gliding into position on each wing. Diane recognized them instantly, a flicker of old memory returning. F-22 Raptors, sleek and gray, flying close enough that she could clearly see the helmeted pilots inside their cockpits. A voice came over the emergency channel, sharp and demanding. "Unidentified aircraft. You are approaching restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately, or you'll be escorted by force." The first officer looked at Diane in complete panic, his hands frozen on the controls. She reached for the radio without a moment of hesitation. "This is civilian Flight 219, she said calmly. "Captain is down. First officer and I are flying manually with one engine, requesting safe passage to the nearest runway." The fighter pilot's voice came back, still suspicious and hard. "You are flying like someone with combat training. State your name and background immediately." Diane paused for only a second before answering, her heart pounding harder than it had in 12 long years. 12 years of hiding, and it all came down to this one moment above the clouds. "My name is Diane Foster," she said clearly. "Former call sign Viper, 91st Fighter Squadron." There was silence on the radio, long enough that Diane wondered if the transmission had failed. Then the fighter pilot's voice changed completely, losing every trace of its hard edge. "Copy that. Stand by." A minute later, a different voice came through, older and calmer, carrying the weight of real authority. "Viper, this is Colonel Briggs, Air Combat Command. We heard your name years ago and never thought we would hear again. Are you really flying that aircraft right now?" Diane almost smiled despite the danger surrounding her. "I am, Colonel, and I need a clear runway, emergency vehicles, and a doctor waiting when we land. My captain needs surgery, and this plane needs a mechanic far more than it needs paperwork." The colonel's voice grew serious again, sharp with urgency. "Copy, Viper. We are clearing runway 27 at Hawkins Air Base right now. Follow the F-22s down. They will guide you in safely." The 2 fighter jets adjusted their positions smoothly, one slightly ahead, guiding the wounded airliner carefully through the thick gray clouds. Diane focused completely on flying, ignoring the fear building in her chest and the sweat forming on her forehead. She calculated the landing speed carefully in her head, knowing that flying on one engine meant far less control and a much harder approach than usual. As the runway came into view through the falling rain, Diane spoke to the passengers over the intercom for the first time since taking the controls. "This is Diane speaking. We are landing shortly at a military airfield. Please stay seated, keep your seatbelts tight, and follow crew instructions the moment we stop." Her voice was calm and steady, the same voice she once used to guide young, frightened pilots through their very first combat missions. The cabin grew quiet, trusting a stranger they had never truly noticed before today, a woman who had spent years fading into the background of ordinary life. Behind her in the cabin, a young mother clutched her crying baby tightly, whispering soft words to keep herself calm as much as the child. An older man across the aisle gripped his armrests, so hard his knuckles turned white, his lips moving silently in prayer. None of them knew the woman flying their plane had once carried far heavier burdens through far more dangerous skies, guiding wounded jets home when engines failed and instruments lied. Diane could not see their faces from the cockpit, but she could feel the weight of every single one of them pressing down on her shoulders, and it steadied her rather than frightened her, the way it always had years ago. The weather worsened as they descended, thick gray clouds rolling in from the coast, pushing hard against the fuselage and rocking the wounded aircraft from side to side. Rain hammered the windshield so heavily that the wipers struggled to keep pace, smearing more water than they cleared. "Viper, you have a crosswind building near 2 o'clock, gusting close to 30 knots, Colonel Briggs warned over the radio, his voice tight with concern. Diane adjusted the controls instinctively, angling the nose slightly into the wind, a technique she had used 100 times before in fighter jets far smaller and far less forgiving than this one. The first officer watched her hands move with quiet amazement, wondering how someone could look so calm while everything around them threatened to fall apart completely. Just as the runway lights appeared through the mist, a fresh problem revealed itself. A warning light blinked on the landing gear panel, and the indicator for the right will refuse to turn green no matter how many times the first officer checked it. "Diane, the gear isn't showing locked," he said, panic creeping back into his voice. Diane's jaw tightened. She reached for the manual gear release lever, pulling it hard while keeping her other hand steady on the controls, splitting her focus between two impossible tasks at once. The light flickered, then finally turned green, but the delay had cost them precious altitude and time they could not afford to lose. "Raptor lead. I have a gear indication issue, resolved but tight on time," Diane said into the radio, her voice betraying only the smallest hint of strain. The escort pilot's voice answered immediately. "Copy, Viper. Runway is clear and foamed. You are cleared to land whenever ready." Diane nodded to herself, adjusting her grip on the yoke. She lowered the flaps carefully, feeling the plane shudder under the added drag, fighting to keep the wings level as the crosswind pushed against the fuselage. The landing was rough. The plane hit the runway hard on one side, sliding briefly before the brakes caught and slowed them down with a violent, shuddering force. Sparks flew from beneath the wing where the earlier engine problem had damaged part of the frame, bright orange against the gray, rain-soaked runway. The aircraft skidded sideways for a moment, and Diane fought the rudder pedals with every ounce of strength left in her legs, refusing to let the plane spin out of control. Finally, the plane stayed upright, skidding to a stop near the emergency trucks already waiting with their lights, flashing brightly through the heavy rain. For a moment, nobody moved. Then cheering broke out through the cabin, passengers hugging each other tightly, crying with pure relief and disbelief. Medical staff rushed onto the plane immediately and pulled the captain out first, working quickly and carefully to keep him stable as they moved him. Diane finally let go of the controls, her hands shaking now that the danger had finally passed and there was nothing left to hold together. The first officer looked at her with wide, exhausted eyes, still frozen in shock at everything that had just happened. "How did you do that?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Diane managed a tired, gentle smile. "A long time ago, this was my job," she said simply, standing up slowly and carefully from the captain's seat, her legs weak beneath her. Outside, as she stepped off the plane in the cold rain, a group of Air Force officers stood waiting near the emergency vehicles, along with Colonel Briggs himself, his uniform already soaked through. He saluted her sharply, water running down his face and collar. "It is an honor, Viper," he said, his voice carrying real respect. F-22s called her Viper over the radio that day, a name she thought she had buried forever 12 years ago, and now the entire airbase knew it too, whispered between officers who had only ever heard the legend before today. Diane returned the salute out of old habit, her arm rising automatically before she even thought about it, then let it drop, suddenly feeling like a tired, ordinary woman again, not a legend from old stories. "I just wanted a quiet life," she told the colonel honestly, pulling her wet sweater tighter around her shoulders. "I am an accountant now. I have a mortgage and a garden that badly needs weeding." The colonel chuckled softly despite the seriousness of the entire day. "Some things people never really leave behind," he said gently. "You proved that today, whether you wanted to or not." Diane looked back at the damaged plane, steam rising from the engine in the rain, and thought quietly about her old wingman, gone 12 years now, and the promise she had made to herself never to fly again as long as she lived. That promise was broken now, completely and permanently, but somehow she felt lighter than she had in years, as if a heavy weight she had carried silently had finally been set down. She had hidden her past for so long, afraid it would consume her completely if she ever let it out again. But today it had saved 52 lives instead of destroying her own. As paramedics wheeled the captain toward a waiting ambulance, stable and breathing steadily, Diane pulled her plain gray sweater tighter around her shoulders one more time and walked quietly toward the terminal. Once again, just an ordinary woman with tired eyes and a mortgage to pay, at least until the next time someone needed a hero to remember how to fly. Later that evening, sitting alone in a small waiting room at the base with a cup of weak coffee in her hands, Diane finally allowed herself to cry, not from fear, but from 12 years of silence finally breaking apart. A young airman knocked gently and told her the captain had made it through surgery and would recover fully. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and thanked him quietly. Somewhere above her, through the small window, the clouds were finally clearing, revealing a wide, open evening sky, the same sky she had once ruled and had spent so long trying to forget.